Hello and welcome. So I'm at a small local market today in Yorkshire, and just as it has for centuries, this market's drawn both locals and visitors looking for fresh fruit and vegetables, cheese and meats, and all those sort of tempting little treats. So while I walk around today, let's step back in time and let's talk about the Brontes, the people of Haworth, and of course what was on their dinner table in the 1840s. We'll explore the meals the Brontes ate, the simple yet sustaining dishes of the poor, and some recipes that might make modern stomachs turn just a little bit. We'll also look at how the food was prepared, where ingredients came from, and how the changing seasons shaped what was available. Just a quick note, this video will include discussions about meat, including how it was prepared and used in the 19th century. If that's not for you, you might just want to skip those sections, and I'll highlight when to skip, so don't worry. So I found somewhere quiet to sit. It was quite loud in the market. There was lots of people and cars coming and going, so I've decided to find somewhere quiet. And where do I end up? On a bench. No surprise. I'm always on benches at the moment. I'm here sat on a bench in the graveyard, and it's lovely and peaceful. But guess what? It's cold again, hence why I've got another big coat on. But it's a glorious day. I can see there's cows over here. The birds are out again. Beautiful, isn't it? But it's still cold. Please spring, please spring. We're more than ready for your spring. Please arrive. In 1840s Haworth, food wasn't as easy to come by as it is today. There weren't any big supermarkets, and because space was so limited in the back-to-back houses, many people couldn't grow their own food. This meant that the Bronte family, like others in the village, would have to rely on local shops for ingredients. These shops were essential for sourcing fresh produce, but because Haworth was a poor rural village, the options were often basic and seasonal. The local shops in Haworth would have sold what was available at the time, and what you could get really depended on the time of year and the seasons. Spring and summer obviously brought fresh fruit and vegetables, things like cabbages, potatoes, carrots and turnips, or Swedes, depending where you are in the country. So I grew up being told that this was a Swede and this was a turnip. But in Yorkshire, this is a turnip and this is a turnip. Who knows? As well as berries and jams and things. But once the colder months arrived, the selection would have been much more limited, and people had to rely on preserved food. For the Brontes, this would have meant eating more preserved meats, pickled vegetables and dried fruit, all of which helped get them through those pretty cold and harsh winters when fresh produce wasn't available. Meat, when it was available, was a luxury, and much of the family's food would have been plant-based. There would have been plenty of hearty stews and soups using whatever vegetables and dried or preserved meats that they did actually have or could find. Bread was a key staple in their diet, and while the Brontes baked their own, the small bakeries in the village would have provided loaves to the occupants of Haworth. Because food had to be used while it was fresh or preserved for later, the changing seasons really did dictate what the Brontes ate. In the warmer months, fresh food would have been easier to come by, but once autumn hit, they would have shifted to food that could be stored for winter. This seasonal cycle meant meals would have had to vary throughout the year. What they had on their plates in July was very different from what they had in February. The Brontes' diet would have been quite simple. It was also wholesome and made from scratch. Tabby, their long-serving servant, would have been familiar with every ingredient that went into each dish. Nothing hidden, no preservatives, no sweeteners or any artificial colouring like we do today. Meals were made with what was locally available, and anything left over was used again, whether it was reworked into a new dish or preserved for future use. It's likely the Brontes had a far healthier diet than we do now, obviously, apart from germ-riddled waters, of course, but their food and their focus on real simple food made the most of actually what they had in front of them. In a world where food was carefully prepared and nothing was wasted, we could learn a lot from the way the Brontës managed their meals. With modern food often being filled with additives and preservatives and excess packaging, there's a lot to be said for reducing waste and going back to basics, just as the Brontës did in their everyday lives. The Bronte family ate simple, wholesome meals, much like their neighbours in Haworth. One such meal was mutton hash, a dish Charlotte Bronte fondly recalls in a letter that she wrote from Brussels to her sisters in December 1843. She wrote, "I should like uncommonly to be in the dining room at home, or in the kitchen, or in the back kitchen. I should like even to be cutting up the hash, with the clerk and some registered people at the other, and you standing by, watching that I put enough flour, not too much pepper, and above all, that I saved the best pieces of the leg of mutton for Tiger and Keeper, the first of which personages would be jumping about the dish and carving knife, and the latter standing like a devouring flame on the kitchen floor. To complete the picture, Tabby blowing the fire in order to boil the potatoes to a sort of vegetable glue." How divine are these recollections to me at this moment. I mean, this gives us a wonderful glimpse into the daily life at the parsonage. Charlotte's words show us how food wasn't just about subsistence, it was part of the home's routine, with Tiger the cat and Keeper the Bronte's beloved dog eagerly waiting for their share. Another essential food in the household was bread, which Emily Bronte herself would bake most days. And like her sisters, Emily was far more at home in the kitchen than at a schoolroom desk, and her baking was well known in the village. According to accounts, she would knead the dough whilst reading a book, completely absorbed in both tasks at once. She had a reputation for being fiercely independent, and it said that if anyone tried to take over her work, she would send them away with a sharp word. Bread was a staple at every meal, served with butter, jam or cheese, and the Brontës, like many families, would have made their own preserves to last through the winter, using fruit from local farms or forage from the moors. Pickles were also common, preserving vegetables and even meat for colder months. While jams and chutneys are still really popular today, some of their pickled dishes might sound less appetising now. For instance, pickled tongue. It was one way of ensuring no part of an animal went to waste. Life in the parsonage kitchen was practical and no nonsense, but there was a certain warmth to it too. Food, family and daily chores intertwined in a way that was as much about routine and comfort as it was about nourishment. For the poorer families in Haworth, meals were far from indulgent. Most people lived hand to mouth, relying on what little they could afford. Wages were low and food prices could be really unpredictable, meaning families had to stretch every ingredient as far as possible. One common dish was pan pie, a simple yet sustaining stew made with root vegetables like potatoes, turnips and carrots, and often with just a few scraps of meat if they were lucky. The broth was sometimes enriched with a marrowbone, which, when boiled, released its fat and nutrients, adding a small but vital boost of flavour and nourishment. Hello! This dish was practical, warming and easy to make with whatever was at hand. Bread or oatcakes would have been served alongside it, to bulk out the meal, of course, and to soak up any leftover broth, making sure nothing was wasted. I've been told that in historical cooking, pie sometimes refers to a dish with a filling, even if it didn't have pastry. To me, the pan pie sounds more like a broth or a soup, nowhere near a pie, which should have a lid. Anyway, meat was a luxury for the poor, and many families go days or even weeks without it, relying instead on potatoes, grains and whatever dairy they could afford. Cheese, being long-lasting, was sometimes the only animal protein available. The seasons really did dictate everything. And in summer and early autumn, there were more variety with fresh vegetables and berries that could be foraged for on the moors, like I said. But in winter, meals were reduced to the bare essentials: potatoes, turnips, onions, but they had to be stored well so that they were the backbone of most meals. Oatmeal was another staple used for porridge, oatcakes or gruel. For those struggling the most, even these simple meals were not guaranteed. The poorest residents of Haworth relied on charity, scraping by on parish relief or the occasional handout of bread and soup from the church or wealthier families. Food for many was a constant worry, and meals like pan pie were as much about survival as they were about subsistence. For those who knew how to set traps or had the patience to catch them, pigeons and rabbit were a valuable source of free food in 1840s. With money tight and butchers' prices quite high, game offered a way to add meat to your diet without the expense of purchasing it. However, trapping wasn't always legal. Landowners controlled much of the countryside, and poaching, which is what it was a real risk for those caught taking game without permission. Yet people still did it, and it was really very common. Stewed pigeon was a practical and warmer meal, especially in colder months. The pigeons, they were slow cooked with root vegetables, with carrots and onions, no surprise, and turnips, to create this rich broth. A thick parsley sauce was sometimes served alongside to balance out that strong gamey flavour of the meat. Those who could afford it might actually roast their pigeon instead, but roasting required more fuel, making stewing the more economical choice. Rabbits were another staple of the countryside diet. If caught fresh, it could be stewed slowly with vegetables and herbs, and sometimes thickened with flour or grains to make the meal more substantial. A common variation was rabbit stew with dumplings, where suet dumplings were cooked in the pot, absorbing the rich flavour of the meat and the broth. Like pigeons though, rabbit was a practical and versatile ingredient, but it wasn't universally enjoyed. Some people found it too lean or tough, while others considered it a treat. For those with no access to game, offcuts from the butchers were another way to get meat cheaply. But for the skilled trapper, a well-placed snare or a net could mean a hot meal without spending any money at all. So I've tried filming this bit a few times, but I get a bit about it, and then I mess up. So let's try again. So nothing went to waste in an 1840s kitchen, especially in a place like Haworth, where food could be scarce and every part of an animal was put to use. Around Martinmas, the traditional time for slaughtering livestock, offal dishes, here we go, were particularly common. These were the parts of the animals that couldn't be preserved as easily as, say, joints of meat, so they had to be eaten very quickly. One such dish was stuffed hearts, which was filled with a mixture of breadcrumbs, suet and herbs before being baked and basted to keep it from drying out. Hearts were a dense, muscular cut, so slow cooking was essential to make them tender. And this was a meal that packed plenty of protein and flavour, though it might not appeal today. Blood was another part of the animal that was used immediately, often made into black pudding, which combined the fresh blood with breadcrumbs, suet and seasoning before being boiled or fried. And some families might have made their own, but it could also have been bought from the butcher's or a market stall. Black pudding is still really common and is found in English breakfast, but I must admit, I hate the stuff. Other organ meats such as liver, kidneys and even lungs found their way into everyday meals. Faggots, a dish made of minced offal, breadcrumbs and herbs, was another way to use up every last scrap. They were formed into small balls and sometimes wrapped in calc fat, a thin membrane from the animal, and baked or even boiled. Even sheep's heads were sometimes on the menu, and in some households it would have been boiled whole for a rich broth, while in others the meat was stripped and used in pies or stews. The brains were sometimes removed and cooked separately, of course they were, scrambled with egg or served on toast. For people in Haworth, eating offal wasn't just about taste, it was about making the most of every available resource. I mean, in a time before refrigeration, waste was not an option, and even the least appetising part of an animal had their place at the table. So whilst looking up local favourites, I came across something called Stanbury pastry. It's a sweet treat, actually comes from the village of Stanbury, just a mile west of Haworth. And it's basically a jam-filled pasty. And it's the kind of simple, comforting food that would have been perfect for tea times in the 1840s. The pastry itself is made from a basic dough, flour, butter, sugar, and a bit of jam. And it's rolled out into circles and then sealed up with more dough. When it's baked, it turns this lovely golden crispy on the outside, and it's got this jam in the inside, giving it this lovely sweetness. And it can be served cold, so you can cut it into quarters, making it a perfect dish for sharing with your friends or your family. It's so easy to make, and I can see why it became so popular. I mean, I could almost imagine this recipe being passed on to people and, ends up in Haworth. I mean, it's a really simple, affordable recipe, and it sounds really tasty. I've put the recipe in the description below so you can have a go at making it at home. I mean, it's really simple. And of course, we can't forget Yorkshire fat rascals, or turf cakes as they were also known. These were kind of rich, buttery scones packed with currants and baked on a griddle over an open fire. Perfect with a cup of tea. Oh, what a cup of tea. Both of these treats have stuck around as part of the regional culinary traditions for years, and they're just so comforting and still used today as they were back in the time of the Brontes. And now I've talked about it, it's making me really, really hungry. Without the luxury of refrigeration, preserving food was absolutely essential, especially during those colder months, like I said, when fresh produce wasn't so easy to come by. One way people made sure that they had something tasty throughout the year was by making jam. Summer fruits like strawberries, raspberries and blackberries would be picked at their peak, cooked down into these sweet sticky jams. They would be stored in the jars, and then they could be enjoyed at any point during the year. I mean, I've got this vision though of Tabby and Martha and the three sisters sat round the table, all cutting and peeling and chopping fruit, obviously whilst eating far too much at the same time, and then making it into these jars of jam. And then of course we've got pickling, a practice that was pretty common, though some of the options might make us raise an eyebrow today. For example, pickle tongue, popular choice. It wasn't as simple as just throwing it into a jar. First, the tongue would have to be cured in brine, which helped to preserve it for about another 2 weeks. And after that, it would then be cooked, ready to eat. Ugh. And while pickle tongue may not sound like something we'd pick up at the supermarket today, it was a practical way to make every bit of meat last longer, especially when fresh meat wasn't always available. Pickling wasn't just about preserving meat though, thank goodness. Vegetables like pickled onions and cucumbers and beets and things like that were also preserved this way, creating this tangy accompaniment to any meal. The process, it helps to keep the food available when it's most needed. I mean, you think about these long winters when you haven't got much in the shops, you could have some pickles or jam. I mean, pickling and jamming, is jamming a word? Jam making is still really popular today, and there is nothing nicer than when your neighbour gives you a jar of jam. Even though you can buy it very cheaply in the supermarket, receiving that jar of jam, you just feel like you've won a prize. Oh, it tastes so much better. Ooh, bells. Maybe it's tea o'clock. Tea o'clock. Morning. It is quite new. It's made out of like this plastic rather than wood, I think. But at least it's in the sun. Yeah, my legs are warm. Presented 2000 trust. So it says 2004, so it's obviously been here a little while. Or they might have put the plaque on a new bench. Don't know, but it's, yeah, I'm in a good place. Yes, some of them really have, haven't they? More than others. It's the weather though. Poor winter gills. Yeah.
Anyway, see you around.
Bye-bye. She didn't have any jam though. Lovely lady. A lady just popped by in one of those little mobility scooters, and next to where I'm filming is a gravestone, and it's very weathered, and she was just saying how sad it is, and it just reminded me of poor Anne Bronte's grave up in Scarborough that's been affected so badly. You know, the original, obviously, the Bronte Society have put a stone, a flat stone, but the original upright gravestone is really, really flaking. And I was explaining to somebody how, you know, bad it's become now. You know, how it's just, I'm sure people are picking bits off as well for souvenirs. I don't know. But yeah, it's just really sad, isn't it? And this grave here is 1837. You know, you think how long it's stood here in this graveyard. Winters, summers, you know, it's seen a lot. So yeah, it just reminded me. I've done a video about Anne's final days before she died at Scarborough. So check that out. I'll pop that in the description. And obviously then you can see what I mean about poor Anne's gravestone. So yeah, but it's what happens, you know, hundreds of years old. The weather here in Yorkshire can be quite harsh, so it's inevitable it might not last forever. Anyhow, it's just started to rain. Typical, isn't it? I think I might have to go and have a cup of tea. Don't need an excuse, do I? But oh, it's raining. Going to go back into the market square, get myself a cup of tea or something, and then the heavens just opened. Luckily, I'm prepared for it today. But yeah, I think I've got rain on the lens. I think that's why it's gone a bit foggy on my head. Look, like ghosts me. Anyway, time to go and get a cup of tea. And I'm really hungry. Filming does that. I think it's all the talking. This makes me really hungry. So, might show you my food, my lunch, my drink. So, stick with me, you know. Find out. It's substantial. Oh, I'm dropping everything. Right. I'm gonna have to do this as a fill-in because I'm getting a bit blah 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 blah. I've lost it. Just had a warning sign come up saying, oh, battery low. So I'm going to try and do this really, really quickly. Food in 1840s Haworth was practical, seasonal, and often quite different from what we eat today. But was it for the worst? Whether it was pan pie or hearty roast pigeon. Every meal had a purpose and a story. What do you think? Anyway, thank you for joining me on this exploration of Bronte era food, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you try any of these dishes? Do you have a family recipe that's been passed down through generations? Let me know in the comments. I suppose my next question is, should we take a leaf out of Tabby's book? Should we be more accountable for every scrap of food that we have? Should we use it well? Should we waste less? Should we care about what we're putting inside us? There's a thought. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do the whole likey, subscribey thing, because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Bronte content. Have a good weekend. Have fun, keep warm, and I will see you all next Friday for more Bronte adventures. Take care. Bye.